Sometimes I lie awake at nights and I wonder how we ended up here. How did we end up in a world dominated by Gibson's ES-335? And it makes me wonder, whatever happened to all those other glorious hollow and semi-hollow guitars? Where did they all go, and what's the deal with all of them? In this video, I'm going to run down Gibson and Epiphone's ES lineup, show you the key differences between each model, and help you make the right choice for you. Let's get started. Good day, friends. Thank you so much for joining me on another video. My name is Justin Waterfield. I work at the Bloor Street Long McQuade store here in Toronto, Ontario. Please like and subscribe if you dig what we're doing here. It really helps out the channel. And feel free to drop us some comments as we go along. In this video, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to our Versus series of videos that we've done so far. Hopefully you guys caught those. We did one on the Gibson Les Pauls, we did one on the Gibson SGs. Now we're going to be talking about ES guitars. And this is going to be part history lesson and also part buyer's guide. We're going to be talking about Gibson and Epiphone models together in the same video, which is going to be kind of fun. We're going to talk about the differences between each model and the reasons why you would choose one over the other. That being said, it is not a comparison video. This isn't a better or worse, right or wrong sort of situation. Everybody's different, everybody's needs are different, and everybody's music is different. And you got to make the decision that's right for you. It's a very personal decision, and hopefully this video is going to give you some insight. The ES lineup as a whole contains a lot of different models and a lot of different model numbers. But the truth of the matter is that there's actually very minor differences from one model to the next. For example, like a 335 and a 336 and a 337 and a 355 and a 359 or whatever. They're very, very, very similar. So the approach that we're going to take on this video is to focus on the milestones that happened throughout the development of the guitars over history that influence the guitars that we know and love today, this sort of iconic Gibson and Epiphone guitars that we think of when we think of hollow bodies and semi-hollow bodies. So what exactly does ES mean? Well, it stands for electric Spanish guitar. And it was used by Gibson as a differentiator from the EH guitars, which were popular at the time, which stood for electric Hawaiian. What's a Hawaiian guitar? What's a Spanish guitar? Well, a Hawaiian guitar is what we know today as a lap steel. So you'd have it sitting on your lap and you'd play it with like a tone bar or a slide or something like that. A Spanish guitar was upright and you'd play it exactly how we know it today. And that's what really developed into the guitar that we all know and love and that we play today. So these guitars are built very similarly to how acoustic guitars are built. They're not just these sort of big blocks of wood that are drilled out like a solid body. ES guitars are built in pieces. So there's the top, there's the back, there's the sides and the neck, and they're all glued together, sometimes with a center block in the case of a semi-hollow guitar. Sometimes they don't have anything inside and they're fully hollow. These guitars typically have F-holes in them, which helps push the air and give you more of an acoustic sound without being plugged into an amp. They typically have cutaways, and there's two main types of cutaway that you're going to see if you read any Gibson literature. There's the Florentine cutaway and there's the Venetian cutaway. And the main difference is that the Venetian cutaway is more rounded like an ES-335. A Florentine cutaway is a sharper, deeper cutaway like an ES-175. Also, ES guitars typically have different bridges and tailpieces than solid bodies, though not always. But especially on hollow bodies, there can be some interesting trapeze-looking tailpieces, and we'll take a look at those later when we get into the individual models. As for pickups, we have P90s and humbuckers. And for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to quickly run down the differences between each one. A P90 is Gibson's single coil pickup. It looks big and wide and fat like a humbucker, but it is actually a single coil. It's just flat and wide. And it is noisy, but it gives you a really rich, detailed mid-range that you just don't get on any other kind of single coil pickup. Then you have humbuckers, and these are very common. When you think of a Gibson guitar, this is the pickup that you think of. They are typically covered with a chrome or nickel cover, or they can be without the cover and they just look like two single coils side by side in the same housing. And these give you a very thick, very warm sound, really pushes the amp, has a lot of power to it, and they are noiseless by design. That's why they're called humbuckers. They buck the hum that's inherent in pickups. Other similarities to Gibson solid bodies would be the scale length. Typically, when you're talking about a Gibson guitar, you're talking about a 24 3/4 scale length. That's the length of the string between the nut and the bridge, and that just dictates how close the frets are together, but also how loose or how tight the strings feel under your fingers. Speaking of necks, we typically are talking about mahogany necks and rosewood fingerboards for the most part. There are other models that have different woods for the fingerboards and the necks, and we're going to talk about those too. And the general look and feel. I mean, Gibson has such a iconic look and feel. When you pick up a Gibson guitar or an Epiphone guitar, even blindfolded, you'll probably get an idea just by the feel of it that you are playing a Gibson or an Epiphone guitar. And when you look at it at a distance, you know exactly what that thing is. It's all part of the same family, and there's definitely a theme running through all of their product line, whether it's a solid body or an ES guitar. So the question is, why would somebody choose to play an ES guitar versus one of Gibson or Epiphone's solid body guitars? Well, there's some big differences. Typically, an ES guitar will have a brighter sound. It has more acoustic volume because it is hollow or semi-hollow, so it really tends to amplify itself to a degree, much like an acoustic guitar. There are weight considerations because, again, hollow or semi-hollow, this isn't a big chunk of wood hanging around your neck. They can typically be lighter than solid bodies, though not always. There are some really, really heavy ES guitars out there, so don't just go for one because of the weight considerations. You do need to look around and feel each guitar in your hands to see if you are saving any bit of weight there by choosing that over a solid body. But more so than anything, the reason why you would choose an ES guitar over a solid body is the playing experience. Typically, hollow or semi-hollow guitars are bigger. They're physically bigger and rounder than solid body guitars. Solid bodies you can make very small and compact, and most of the sound, I would argue, of a solid body comes from the pickups themselves and the electronics and the strings and the wood all like being closely, tightly anchored together. Hollow bodies and semi-hollow bodies are a lot looser, and there's a lot more breathing room. There's a lot more interaction with the air that's inside the guitar, and you get more of an experience almost like you're playing an acoustic guitar that can just be amplified as you would an electric guitar. And that's really the benefit, is that in a way, you get the best of both worlds. So who uses ES guitars? Tons of people. And These are not exclusively jazz guitars or anything like that, despite what you may think. Some of the people that use these, and this is a very small list, but some of the people that use ES guitars on the regular are Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters. We got B.B. King. We have Eric Clapton. You have Alex Lifeson from Rush. You got Freddie King. You got Chuck Berry, Pat Metheny, Wes Montgomery, a couple of jazz guys. Tom DeLonge from Blink-182 uses a semi-hollow as well. And Steve Howe from Yes. The list goes on and on and on. It really doesn't matter what style of music you play. These guitars are great for just about everything. Historically speaking, we can consider the ES model lineup as being split into three different groups. We have the 100 series, the 200 series, and the 300 series. Nowadays, Gibson and Epiphone typically only make the 100 and the 300 series. The 200 series has kind of gone by the wayside. If it helps, you can, again, in very general terms, you can think about the 100 series as the big hollow body jazz guitars. And the 300 series would be considered the thinner, center block, sort of thin line guitars like a 335 or something of that ilk. Again, generally speaking, there are many exceptions to this rule. We're going to be getting to that in a second. Another thing I should mention before we jump in here is the model numbers themselves. Now, Gibson, back in the day when they were in the process of releasing these models over time, the model numbers didn't really mean a whole lot other than they referenced the original price. So for example, when the ES-175 debuted in the 1940s, it cost $175, and that's why they called it the ES-175. But then when you look at later developments like the 225 or the 150 or whatever, you think, oh, maybe the 150 is like the lower end model and the 175 is the higher end model. No, not necessarily. These are just numbers that Gibson was pulling out of a hat, seemingly, just to name their products over time. So don't think of it like, oh, this is the next iteration or this is the better model. Has nothing to do with that. Plenty of confusion ahead, so buckle up. Before we even talk about electric guitars, we got to go right back to the very beginning. In 1922, when the Archtop guitar was invented by a luthier named Lloyd Loar. This thing had no central sound hole like an acoustic guitar, which had been around forever. This thing had a rigid top with F-holes in it. And the intention here was to have more wood to vibrate and therefore project more into the audience. And I'm sure most people who've played an Archtop guitar will agree with me that when you're the one playing it, it really doesn't sound like a whole lot of anything. But if you are the audience, if you're the one sitting across from somebody who's playing an Archtop, there's a huge amount of volume coming off of this thing. And that's really the intention, so that the guitar player could be heard on level with the rest of the band. And by band, keep in mind this is the 1920s, so a band was like a horn section. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't other guitar players or a keyboard player necessarily. This is like band. And this allowed the guitar player to become more of a contributing member to the overall sound of those bands at the time. Then in 1936, Gibson has the bright idea to outfit an Archtop guitar with a factory-installed electronic pickup. This guitar was called the ES-150. It came with an EH-150 amp as a kit, and it cost, funny enough, $150 at the time. How's that for inflation? This guitar and amp combo was quickly adopted by a fellow named Charlie Christian, and the popularity of the electric guitar exploded. At this point in the presentation, I want to take a quick sidebar and discuss who exactly Charlie Christian is, because again, this is one of those things that this is the bedrock of everything that we know about electric guitar today. Charlie Christian was a young black guitar player in Harlem who played swing and jazz and pretty much helped define the bebop style of jazz guitar as part of Benny Goodman's sextet and orchestra. I'm not a huge jazz guy. I wouldn't assume to preach the virtues of this style of jazz over the other, but it is hard to overstate Charlie Christian's influence on guitar playing, because what he did was really interesting. He had an Archtop guitar, which is loud on its own, And then he hooked it up through an amplifier, and suddenly he was heard above the rest of the band. And what he did is he really popularized the way of playing single note lines as opposed to just comping on chords in the background as a rhythm instrument. He really stepped out to the front and made the guitar a lead instrument. He was really one of the first famous lead guitar players. He was the first guitar hero, believe it or not. Artists like T-Bone Walker, Scotty Moore, Cliff Gallup, Eddie Cochran, Miles Davis, all these guys, they idolized what this guy was doing at the time. And he had such a short career. The poor guy died when he was only 25. He really only had a couple of years of popularity. But again, his influence on guitar players from that point onwards cannot be overstated. Your favorite guitar player's favorite guitar player, that's who this guy influenced. You know what I'm saying? Like the people that influenced somebody like Eric Clapton, they were influenced by Charlie Christian, right? If you look at, for example, John Lennon, right? He had a Gibson Les Paul Jr. He had a Charlie Christian pickup put in. And who knew that John Lennon, such a rock and roll dude, even knew who Charlie Christian was? But that's what I mean, right? That influence is still heard today. Everybody from like Wes Montgomery to like all these jazz guys, they all picked up on this style that was started by Charlie Christian. And we as guitar players as a whole owe this guy a huge debt of gratitude. Never forget where he came from, kids. In 1949, we have the debut of the ES-175. This is a fully hollow archtop guitar that is built with electronics in mind. This is that Florentine cutaway I was telling you guys about. Nice and deep with that sharp horn there, looks very fancy schmancy. And that basically gives you unfettered upper fret access so you can wheedle-wee to your heart's content. There's been a few versions of this guitar since its introduction. It was introduced as a single P90 version here in the neck. Then it gained a bridge pickup in 1953. And then a humbucker version replaced it in 1957. And that's pretty much what we've got here, is the two humbucker 1957 version. And I should say this is the longest running and most popular jazz guitar ever, period. Let's hear what it sounds like. So that was my sorry attempt at playing jazz, but it's not about me. It's about the guitar. Let's talk about this thing. So what we have here in terms of electronics, we have two full-size Gibson humbuckers with the covers, very, very warm, very smooth sounding pickups. We have four knobs here, and this is Gibson's classic control setup. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, let me run it down for you. We have a volume and a tone control for the bridge pickup. We have a volume and a tone control for the neck pickup. And then we have this three-way switch here at the top that lets you select either the bridge on its own, or the neck on its own, or both together. And between all these controls, you can paint with a lot of different colors. You can set each pickup to its own volume level or brightness level and toggle between them like a lead and a rhythm sound. Or you can keep your selector in the middle and have both pickups on at the same time and balance one against the other. You can do a lot with just these controls here. One interesting feature on this particular guitar is the mahogany back and sides. This is not classic as per the 175 formula. Typically, this thing would have had maple back and sides from the factory, but this seems to be a special one-off guitar that was built probably in the 90s sometime, I'm guessing. Now, sadly, this is one of those many ES guitars that Gibson no longer makes in their current lineup. But the purpose of me bringing it in and showing it to you guys today is so that you can see what it looks like and hear what it sounds like. This is really the poster child for the big, thick, fully hollow jazz box jazz guitar from Gibson. And it comes to me by way of John Elliott at the Toronto Long McQuade store. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you trusting me with your baby. And before we move on, let's hear what this thing sounds like with some crazy distortion. Now, this isn't what a lot of jazz guys do, but hey, we're here, might as well. So, I should say, I had no idea how this was going to sound before I did it, but this just proves my point that I made earlier, that if this is the guitar that inspires you, then by all means, play whatever kind of music on it. This is not a capital J jazz guitar. Run it through a rat like I just did, a rat pedal, you know what I mean? Like, use the tool that makes you happy. Fast forwarding to 1955, Gibson releases the ES-225, and this is a really underrated guitar in terms of it being pivotal to the development of the semi-hollow body guitar as we know it today. Essentially, the ES-225 is a thin-bodied ES-175, so back to front, it's not nearly as deep. It came with two P90s right off the hop, neck and a bridge model, and it had a center block, so a piece of maple, underneath the bridge of the guitar. So the bridge, which anchors the strings, was screwed through the top into the center block. And what this did was reduce the amount of feedback that you'd get through a loud amp. And I think it's worth talking about what exactly feedback is, because that's going to influence sort of the rest of the story here. Feedback is what happens when your guitar starts to hear itself through an amplification source. So if you plug in an acoustic guitar, say, to a loud amp, the speaker from the amp will move the top of the acoustic guitar, and that will feed into the amp, which will then spit out that sound and go in a big feedback loop, and it'll start to howl and screech and whistle and do all sorts of crazy things. And this was very much a battle that all guitar players were fighting at the time, at the dawn of amplification, is how do I make myself loud enough without this guitar screeching and howling and feeding back? And the ES-225, with its sort of partial center block in the middle of the body to anchor the bridge, really stabilized the top and the back and sandwiched them together against a solid piece of wood and kept them from vibrating in sympathy with the amplifier. And that really helps point us in the direction of what was to come later. This guitar here is what I consider to be the closest living relative to an ES-225. This is an ES-135, which is the same general shape as the 175 we just looked at, but check this out. It's quite a bit thinner. It's not nearly as deep. Now, it doesn't have all the same features that we were talking about with the 225. This is actually quite different under the hood. It's got a couple of really interesting features that I don't see a whole lot of on the ES lineup. For example, it has a maple neck, which is cool. It's got the gold hardware, it's got the trapeze tailpiece. This particular 135 has a center block all the way through, and this bridge is drilled through the top into the center block. And this is exactly what I was talking about. That center block helps sandwich the top and the back together, and it makes it less likely to vibrate in sympathy with loud volume coming from an amp. This guitar comes to me courtesy of my man Adam Hutchinson at the Bloor store. Thank you, Adam, for letting me borrow this thing. I know this is your baby, and I muchly appreciate it. Now, before we move on to the really modern stuff, let's stay in 1955 for a minute and talk about the Byrdland and the ES-350. So these were thinner body guitars, again, much like the 225. Actually, all three were released around the same time, and they were meant to be a trio of thinner bodied guitars. But the Byrdland and the 350 were fully hollow. They didn't have any center block, nothing doing like that. Why I'm lumping these two together is because they had a weird neck that Gibson really hasn't done since, at least not to my knowledge. They had a 23.5-inch scale and a really narrow nut spacing. So the string spread was not quite as wide. It was much more narrow and a much more compact neck by almost an inch, which means that the frets were closer together and the strings were closer together. And this setup didn't quite take off quite as well as the standardized Gibson 24 3/4 scale length. But it is interesting to note who played these guitars and who made them famous. So we have Ted Nugent playing on the Byrdland, which is just such a bonkers combination, right? Like Ted Nugent with all that gain and high volume and distortion, and he's up there playing like a hollow body guitar, but I mean, he utilized that feedback and that sort of uncontrollable sound to his advantage, clearly. But check this out. Chuck Berry was a big proponent of the ES-350, right? And with those frets being closer together, that's how he got that sort of like chugging back and forth, sort of reaching over with his pinky, Johnny Be Good kind of rhythm playing, because the frets were compressed and closer together. Really interesting. If he didn't have that guitar, who knows whether he would have come up with that style. Around the same time, another weird, interesting, mythical beast was released upon the unsuspecting public, and that is the ES-5 Switchmaster. This is a really wild departure for Gibson, and it really hasn't been replicated since, again, as far as I know. What you had was a big hollow body guitar again, but it had 3 pickups, a neck, a middle, and a bridge, all P90s, and a volume and tone control for each pickup. So you had 6 knobs in total, and you had a 5-way switch that would give you each pickup on its own, but then also blend 2 pickups at a time. So either the neck in the middle or the bridge in the middle. Lots and lots of tones to be had. This guitar here should look familiar to most of you. Now we're getting into the modern stuff. This is the ES-335. Let's hear it. The year is 1958, and Ted McCarty is in charge of Gibson guitars. But not only is he the president, he's also an inventor, and he played a huge part in the development of guitar technology in terms of really solidifying what a humbucker is and how it functions and how it sounds, and a tunematic bridge where you can intonate each string independently of the other. But the other thing that he did is he took a thin line hollow body guitar, and inside he put a maple center block that goes all the way from the neck right back here to the bridge pin underneath the pickups and the bridge, so that everything is mounted to that solid block of wood, and the wings of the guitar stay hollow. So you really get the best of both worlds. You get a nice bright acoustic sound, but you also are able to play through a really loud roaring amp, which was becoming more popular at the time. We have maple and poplar ply back and sides and the top. Very, very bright, very, very resonant guitar. We have dual cutaways up here, so you can get right to the top of the neck. Also, the neck joins right here at the very top frets. I would almost argue this is what gave Gibson the idea to build the SG the way they did, with the dual horns and mounting the neck right up here. And I would even go so far as to say the control layout was influenced by the ES-335. On a Les Paul and the sort of bigger hollow bodies like the 175, the switcher is up here and the controls are down here. Whereas on the ES-335, everything moves to this section. Your switcher, your volume, your tones, everything is in one place. You don't have to go to two different places to change your tone. And again, I have a feeling this really influenced the development of the SG. Now, I should say there are two sort of classic versions of the ES-335. There's the 50s version and there's the 60s version. So what I got in my hands right now, this is a Gibson Custom Shop Murphy Labs 1958 ES-335. This is as close as you're going to get to pulling one of these out of the case brand new in 1958. It's got the massive neck. Everything is vintage correct. The pickups are exactly the same. The hardware, the specs on the pots, the taper on the pots, the paint job, everything is exactly perfect. And this one is actually aged quite a bit. So this is more like your grandfather, your uncle's 335 that they've generously bestowed upon you to carry on playing. This has dot inlays and no neck binding whatsoever. This is how they originally came from the factory. In the 1960s, Gibson changed this. They started putting neck binding on it, like a Les Paul or an SG, and they gave it block inlays. So interesting fact, this is why you'll sometimes see older Epiphone 335 type models that were called the dot instead of the 335. They were referring to the dot neck version, the 50s version of the ES-335 format. So, interesting little tip for you. Now let's hear what this thing sounds like clean. In 1959, Gibson, riding high on the popularity of the 335 format, releases the ES-345, which is largely the same as the 335, but with some upgrades. They made it look nicer, they gave it some fancier inlays and new finishes and stuff like that. But the electronics upgrades were the more interesting thing that they added. They gave the ES-345 a Varitone switch, which was fairly common on that model. But what was less common was a stereo output section. And this was basically, in addition to each pickup having its own volume and tone controls, they had their own output jack, so you could send each pickup to its own amplifier. Not a terribly useful or popular feature, so they dropped that after a while. But the Varitone was used to great effect by one B.B. King. And this is exactly what I got here. I have B.B. King's signature model from Epiphone. This is the Lucille. And it has the Varitone switch right here. And what this switch is, it's basically a network of capacitors. And each switch, or each position on the switch, filters out more and more of your bottom end until you're left with just like a peak in the mid-range and maybe a little bit of treble. So what you get is this really nasal cutting tone, and that is the sound of B.B. King. So I'm going to demo this for you. I'm going to leave the selector switch in the middle. I'm going to start with the switch bypassed, so in position 1, and then I'm going to work my way up, and you're going to hear the sound get thinner and thinner and thinner as we go. This is the ES-355, and this is essentially analogous to a Les Paul custom. So there was the standard Les Paul, and then there was a custom Les Paul, which is essentially the same thing, just dressed up in a really nice way. Nicer binding, different inlays on the fretboard, but we also get a different fretboard material. And largely the same thing is going on here. So we have 5-ply binding. We got a nice sort of tortoiseshell pickguard. We got gold hardware, which was specific to the custom and to the 355. We have an ebony fretboard as well. And for the eagle-eyed viewers, what's going on in the headstock? This is an Epiphone with a Gibson headstock. So what's up with this? For those of you that don't know, earlier this year, Epiphone released the Inspired by Custom Shop lineup, where they basically do more affordable versions of their Gibson's custom shop only models. And this is one of them. We have a one-piece mahogany neck, no scarf joint on the headstock. This thing is massive. It's big, it's fat, it's lovely. Big necks equal big tone. Always remember that. But here, I got a custom shop 355. I'm going to show you this. Hang on one second. So here we have two opposite ends of the spectrum. We have the Epiphone version that is made in China. Here we have the Gibson Custom Shop Murphy Lab top-of-the-line version made in Nashville. These are both ES-355 guitars. They both have one-piece necks. They both have ebony fretboards. They both have Gibson hand-wound custom bucker pickups in the neck and the bridge. They both have Gibson historic hardware. the bridge and the aluminum tailpiece. They both have USA-made CTS potentiometers, the volume and the tone pots, with Mallory caps. They essentially have all the same features, but one is made in China and one is made in the States. So the question is there a difference? Yeah, there is a difference. But which one do you prefer? That's the question, and that's the question only you can answer. And this is why I always say to people, try a guitar in your hand, in store, plugged in through an amp, if you possibly can. Don't just go by price, don't just go by country of origin. These are sort of preconceptions that you need to get beyond. Maybe you'll walk in to a Long McQuade being like, yeah, I want the Murphy Lab, and you're just like, well, maybe that's not speaking to me, but hey, this Epiphone sure sounds great, and you'll walk out with this one. Maybe it'll be vice versa, right? You gotta try these things for yourself. Always remember that. So successful was the ES-335 for Gibson that they started to do all kinds of variations on the theme, including in the Epiphone product line. Now, about a year ago, we did a video exploring Epiphone's entire product line, and you can find the link right up here somewhere if you'd like to know more about Epiphone products. And I've got one right here. This is the updated version of the Sheraton model that we showed in that video. This has been updated to be more vintage correct. So we have mini humbuckers as opposed to the full-size humbuckers that we've been looking at so far. And then we have this funky frequencator tailpiece, which is also vintage correct. So specs-wise, this is exactly the same as an ES-335, except for these pickups in this bridge system. And it does sound quite different. Mini humbuckers sense less of the string. It's a more narrow aperture, and it makes them quite a bit brighter, which you're going to hear right now. The year is 1961, and Epiphone is now a part of Gibson guitars. A lot of Epiphone models are being made side by side on the same production line in Kalamazoo, Michigan as the Gibsons. And everybody has caught thin line fever. Gibson is continuing to crank out thin-bodied, semi-hollow and fully hollow guitars, and this is one of them. This is the Epiphone Casino. Now, I thought it was worth bringing down this particular model because this is made in the States again. Most Epiphone guitars are made in China, and there is a Chinese version of the Casino, which you'll find just about anywhere. This is the USA-made version, so this is made side by side with all of these lovely Gibsons that we've been looking at today, and it is quite a bit different in terms of the quality of materials. But what exactly do we have here in the Casino format? Well, we have a thin body guitar. It's fully hollow, so there's no center block, even though it looks like a 335, it is not. Fully hollow, so it's totally susceptible to feedback. It howls in front of a loud amp, but that's kind of the fun of it. But check this out. The bridge is drilled into the top, but there's no center block. Like there's nowhere else for it to go. And as a result, they had to use a floating tailpiece. This is called a trapeze tailpiece. Kind of looks like, I guess, a trapeze, I guess. But as a string anchor, if they drill this into the top without anything underneath to support it, it would just tear right out. So it hooks round to the end pin, and that's where the strings anchor. And that just gives a little bit more resonance, a little bit more looseness to the sound. On an already loose-sounding hollow body guitar, this thing is a ton of fun to play. The other thing that's interesting is that the neck joins the body pretty far up the neck. It joins at the 17th fret, which is unusual. Again, all the ES-335 style guitars that we've been looking at today join the neck almost right here at the top, but this joins much further up. And this gives the guitar a really small feel, right? It just kind of like wraps around your body. It's really, really comfortable to play, and it sounds like $1,000,000. I'm going to show you. Fast forward all the way to 2007 and the release of a modern classic occurs. This is the ES-339. Essentially, this is a shrunk down version of an ES-335. It's been put in the hot water wash and it went all small and tiny. And it's quite a different experience than playing a 335. There's less volume of air internally, so the acoustic response is not quite as loud and brash as a 335. It's really ideal for players who like the idea of playing something semi-hollow, who want the best of both worlds, but who just can't get along with that gigantic size and can't quite get their arms around it. Even though it's a thin body, 335s are very big guitars. This is the perfect answer for that. And here's what it sounds like. So hopefully you've been able to see a logical progression here, starting with the big jazz boxes, and then things got thinner and thinner and thinner and started incorporating elements of solid body guitars to become what we know today as the Gibson and Epiphone ES lineup. There were a lot of slight variations that came and went over time, and most of them just are no longer made. Gibson has really focused on expanding the 335 and 339 lineup, both in the standard USA line and the custom shop line and the Murphy Lab line, as well as the more affordable Epiphone lineup and even the custom shop Epiphone lineup. So there's still plenty of choice to choose from. And who knows, maybe things may be coming down the pipe later on. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much for joining me on this video, friends. I really appreciate it. Hope you learned a lot. Extra special thank you to John Elliott and Adam Hutchinson at the Bloor Street Long McQuade store for lending me your guitars so I can show all you lovely people. Make sure you get down to your local Long McQuade store and try out some ES hollow bodies, semi-hollow bodies if you can. If you've never tried any of these guitars before, you're in for a real treat. If you'd rather shop online, that is available too, longandmcquade.com, and the links to everything will be in the description below. Make sure you like and subscribe if you dig what we're doing here. It really helps out the channel. And again, my name is Justin Waterfield. I'll see you next time.